Mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir. Je suis très ému de pouvoir modérer cette soirée particulière qui va réunir deux grands artistes, des artistes majeurs qui ont eu une occasion rêvée de se rencontrer dans les années 80 autour de l'art, autour de leur création, autour aussi, je pense, d'intérêts communs. Et certainement de moments qui ont été fondateurs pour l'une et l'autre des pratiques. Il s'agit bien évidemment d'Agustin Fernandez et de Robert Mapplethorpe. Aujourd'hui, nous devons déjà remercier très chaleureusement Reed Hall et Columbia University. Je suis très ému parce que j'ai passé ici même mon habilitation en 2010. J'y reviens aujourd'hui en tant que modérateur. Je remercie d'ailleurs en passant Claire Fernandez et également Hélène Sirven et Jean-Philippe Aka qui ont pensé à mettre en perspective quelque part les arts plastiques, la vision que nous avons dans un rapport entre pratique et théorie, et également cette faculté que nous pouvons avoir à certains moments de mettre en lien, de favoriser la relation, dans le sens non seulement d'une philosophie de la relation et d'une poétique de relation à la Édouard Glissant, mais également dans une relation qui est une continuité. Et je pense qu'une fondation telle que la fondation d'Agustin Fernandez est aujourd'hui un lien fondamental pour la compréhension de ce travail et également sa monstration, je pense, au-delà des frontières et certainement une connaissance du public qui doit s'intensifier dans un cadre où, à certains moments, la violence et l'érotisme peuvent également entraîner une pensée créatrice, une recherche-création, plus que finalement, je dirais, une rupture. Je crois que le côté disruptif de la pratique d'Agustin Fernandez est véritablement un hymne à la vie et également à une forme de relation que l'art se doit toujours d'avoir avec le monde, c'est-à-dire un rapport à la résistance, et une forme de lâcher-prise dans un sens certainement surréaliste, comme pouvait également le ressentir Agustin Fernandez dans ses œuvres, mais aussi dans un rapport à l'observation et à la captation des moments que nous traversons. Donc ce rapport à la réalité qui va aujourd'hui être transmis dans cette relation qui a existé et qui perdure à travers le temps entre Agustin Fernandez et Robert Mapplethorpe, va être aussi dépeinte et traduite par d'éminents collègues qui vont aujourd'hui se succéder. Alors nous aurons Rocio Aranda Alvarado, donc ici présent, qui prendra la parole en premier. Ensuite, nous aurons Christian Gattinoni, Jonathan Katz, et pour finir, Zoé Valdés. Voilà, nous nous sommes vus déjà hier soir, c'était un vrai plaisir de se rencontrer, et je crois que cette relation qui va maintenant nous permettre aussi d'en savoir plus sur le lien entre les deux artistes sera certainement éclairante. Donc nous allons accueillir dans un premier temps Rocio Aranda Alvarado. Elle est curatrice au musée Del Barrio, qui est le musée latino de New York. Elle est également professeure au City College de New York, où elle enseigne l'art d'Amérique du Sud et l'art contemporain américain. Elle a publié des articles dans des revues, des ouvrages, ainsi que dans des catalogues d'expositions, nombreuses expositions. Son sujet « Only in New York, Agustin Fernandez and the Aesthetic of Punk » montre l'importance du contexte dans lequel Fernandez a évolué alors qu'il s'installait avec sa famille à New York en 1972, survenant en parallèle de la naissance du mouvement punk. Il était très proche de Mapplethorpe, qui était aussi très lié avec le mouvement punk, notamment à travers la relation avec Patti Smith. Donc je laisse la parole à Rocio Aranda Alvarado.
Bonsoir. Merci à tout le monde pour venir ce soir. Merci à Claire pour l'invitation. C'est tout le français que je parle, so I will speak in English. Sorry, I'll do my best. Okay. Agustin Fernandez and his family arrived to New York City around 1972, but his work was already known previously in exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art. He was included in exhibitions in 1958, 1966, and again in 1967. And I'm just showing a couple of examples of works that are in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art that were purchases made through the Rockefeller Inter-American Fund. So his work was already known, but in this brief presentation, I'd like to illustrate how his work changed after he came to New York, influenced, of course, by his time in Paris, and maybe in Puerto Rico also, but especially by the context in which he came to live and work, which was the growth and development of the punk movement in downtown New York especially, and also his relationship with Robert Mapplethorpe. And I don't want to suggest that either of these influences were direct, but rather that our understanding of Agustin's paintings are enriched by evoking these connections to their cultural environment. And that it represents not so much a shift in the artist's discourse as a way of layering meaning that's evoked by a new life in downtown Manhattan. And so what was happening in the environment of downtown Manhattan? Among the kinds of things you could see in downtown New York during this time were performances and happenings by artists like Carolee Schneemann and Joan Jonas. Also, children playing in the blighted neighborhoods of the Lower East Side and the South Bronx, and the prevalence of gang culture. Here's an example of a gang from Williamsburg, Brooklyn, but they were all over New York City at the time, no? And then all of this was accompanied by new musical genres in the form of punk and no wave, which were on display at these legendary clubs in downtown Manhattan, CBGB and Max's Kansas City. The breadth and the scope of these cultural phenomena illustrates the diversity of the world into which Fernandez had moved by the mid-1970s. So downtown Manhattan, the space between 14th Street and the southern tip of the island, is described by historian Marvin Taylor like this. In the mid-1970s, a distinctly new attitude towards artistic production surfaced in downtown New York. It was not a new aesthetic, not a new style, and not a unified movement, but rather an attitude toward the possibilities and production of art, influenced by the symbolists, the beats, New York School, the Situationists, by Dada, pop, the hippies, Marxists, and anarchists. Downtown New York artists sought to push the limits of traditional categories of art. Downtown works undermine their traditions of art, music, performance, and writing at the most basic structural levels. Rather than overthrow traditional forms and establish a new movement, downtown works sought to undermine from within the traditional structures of artistic media and the culture that had grown up around them. Here's a slide of Gordon Martha Clark's restaurant Food from Soho in the early 1970s. This scene, ever growing and changing with new demographics molding the city and its culture, became the backdrop to the paintings of Agustin Fernandez and the new home his family when they just moved to a place just north of Washington Square Park at 5th Avenue and 11th Street. For New Yorkers, this is historian Marvin Taylor continuing, for New Yorkers, downtown is synonymous with experimentation. Experimentation with art, sex, drugs, rock and roll. He notes that nothing fueled the experimentation and the sensibilities of the downtown scene as much as punk. The significance of this neighborhood is underscored by the visitors that sought out this new sound, its attendant styles, and the politics that matched both of these. A New York Times article discussing the New York underground rock scene noted, "The scene itself is that complex underground rock, bands that are spawned in a few lower Manhattan clubs, so far the scene has appealed to a curious nexus of bohemians, punks, and intellectuals that frequent these clubs. And I think this is significant for our discussion of Agustin's work. Not that he went to these clubs, but that he would have seen the youth that was attending these clubs and certainly have understood the environment of it. And especially because I think there's a strong visual connection between the surface aesthetics of punk and with Agustin's paintings. The punk era and the years that immediately followed are described by one of the participants. He said, "Despite the legacy of CBGB, the Ramones, a band, and Punk magazine, New York was never really a punk rock town. It actually produced very little in the way of punk as punk alone. The genuine tradition of New York bands was art rock, with punk merely being just one of its aspects. In a certain light, even the Ramones, who presented such a complete high-concept package, could be viewed as some kind of performance art piece. New York's alluring danger reeked of outlaw freedom and possibility. Artists, writers, musicians, and hangers-on and wannabes of all stripes were drawn to its incendiary profile from across the globe." So this is a picture of a band called the New York Dolls, who are sort of a quintessential New York punk band. The description of this downtown New York scene is especially relevant to a band that emerged in 1974, known as the New York Dolls. Music critics and historians alike agree that this group was unique in its avant-garde tendencies, fusing performance, simplistic sound, and outrageous costuming in their act. In this image, we see some of the same signals that are emblematic of Agustin's own imagery. Stark contrasts of masculinity and femininity, hard and soft, gay and straight. By the mid-1970s, the music scene in New York had evolved to foster a sound of its own and an aesthetic that accompanied it. And certainly this, I think, grimness of urban life that's described by many of the people who lived in New York at the time, with its vast influences, was evident in downtown when Agustin and his family came. In his study of punk as an aesthetic challenge to conservative hegemony, Dick Hebdige examines the ways in which objects, especially those worn by punk youth, are infused with meaning. This meaning, in turn, is worn on the surface of the body, not only to signify personal style, but more importantly, to represent meaning related to political ideologies, race, class, gender, and sexuality. Hebdige quotes the noted surrealist Max Ernst, and he elaborates. The subcultural bricoleur, like the author of a surrealist collage, typically juxtaposes two apparently incompatible realities on an apparently unsuitable scale, and it is there that the explosive junction occurs. Punk exemplifies most clearly the subcultural uses of these anarchic modes. It too attempted through perturbation and deformation to disrupt and reorganize meaning. It too sought the explosive junction. These visual elements that Hebdige describes as a slight deviation, a small crime against the natural order, become what he calls the construction of a style, a gesture of defiance or contempt. Like punk, the visual disruptions of Agustin's paintings and drawings, in this case, ask the viewer to reconsider the nature of surfaces and their meanings when placed together. The juxtaposition of soft flesh with metallic armor, of human appendages with tools for slicing, become potent symbols of humanity and also timely reflections of the contemporary culture in which he lived. This gesture is particularly apt in works whose creator had the opportunity to experience the genesis of New York punk and post-punk culture by just walking the streets of his neighborhood. And Agustin Fernandez, Calea's brother, mentions how Agustin often liked to walk in his neighborhood. He would walk to the art store, which was across his entire neighborhood, and also Soho, the next neighborhood further downtown. And so just by walking to the art supply store, he would have encountered many of the punk youth in the streets and maybe even the sounds of the music. Let's see. The contradictions that are represented by these public gestures of punk, the torn clothing, I'll just show an example here, torn clothing worn with thick boots and leather jackets, piercings in places never before considered possible, hair that defied gravity. These are all equally prevalent, I think, throughout the artist's body of work. And as one historian noted, there is a disturbing oscillation between inside and outside, between cutting and touching, and the viewer is touched by the continuous surface of boundless desire. Among his images, Agustin often featured other representations of razor blades or actual blades incorporated into his sculptural works. And to be completely accurate, he began to use razor blades in the 1960s while still living in Paris. But I think that it's important to think about how this kind of object used within this body of work that also shows lace or scraps of leather becomes even more significant. And he talked about razor blades. In 1992, he said, "They are everyday objects. There is nothing dangerous about them." Significantly, razor blades made prominent appearances in at least two major 20th century movements, Surrealism and punk, both of which Fernandez experienced at their points of origin or gestation. Art historians and critics have also noted the alternating tension and relaxation that are evident in Agustin's New York paintings. Also, during this period, we see images in which leather or patches of armor or armored objects occupy the principal space of the canvas. Like punk costume that was intended as protective but also as provocative, Agustin's armored or leather works reflect a kind of impermeability that is equal parts lure and repellent, right? He shares this aesthetic paradox, I think, with the underground gay aesthetic of Robert Mapplethorpe's photos of the 1970s. One of the most significant relationships that Fernandez would cultivate while he lived in New York City was his friendship with Robert. The works of both artists is marked by challenges to the norms of culture and social expectations, as well as some adherence to the legacy of the classical nude. Mapplethorpe was born in Floral Park, Queens. Dropping out of Pratt Institute, he became an important part of the New York underground scene, forming a close relationship with the musician and punk goddess Patti Smith, who in turn became his muse. Indeed, Mapplethorpe's attenuated and pasty figure, his preference for leather and metal-studded accessories, white t-shirts or athletic tanks, and heavy boots all underscore his adherence to these codes of New York street fashions of the various underground cultures, both gay and straight, punk and straight. And I'll show you an example here. In Mapplethorpe's Patrice, this is a photograph from 1977, we see a kind of a portrait shot from the waist down and focusing our view on Patrice's lower regions, which are covered by the soft fabric of a chalk strap and framed at the top by the straps and buckles of a leather biker jacket. In Agustin's paintings from this period, soft, round, fleshy forms are strapped down by a series of leather belts that weave their way across the forearms and across the canvas. Separated by each strap of leather, the forms become more vulnerable, bursting with a sense of flesh that appears to lie just below the surface. A series of drawings from the same period multiplies this contradictory image, showing a profusion of soft, fleshy forms bound all over with a series of leather straps. This same body of work is reflected in Mapplethorpe's representation of the body of Lisa Lyon, also bound up by black leather straps, her powerful muscles marking a contrast to these rigid, dark lines. And then I'm just ending here to talk about the relationship between Mapplethorpe's body and what we see in Agustin's paintings. Mapplethorpe always preferred the word unexpected to the word shocking, which also I think is an apt descriptor for some of Agustin's works. Both artists were influenced by the unexpected juxtapositions of the surrealists, by the experimental and sexual nature of their imagery. Agustin made a number of large paintings that prominently contrasted the delicacy of flesh with metal. These two works feature a close-up of a pierced nipple, both painted after Robert had visited the Fernandez family at their home in Puerto Rico. At the beach, Agustin would have seen Robert's pierced nipple, an image that clearly made a lasting impression. A unique venture at this time, I'll just show you this, that if you go home and go to YouTube, you can find a video of Robert Mapplethorpe's nipple being pierced, because it was still unusual at this time to pierce a nipple. And in fact, apparently the doctor, who was a friend who pierced the nipple, pierced it actually just above the nipple because he was afraid that he might even get cancer from piercing the actual nipple itself. So it's become part of several documentaries about Robert's life, but also about downtown New York. Agustin's work, the pleasure of particular surfaces like soft flesh, lace, and smooth metal or leather, combined with the presence of other seemingly incompatible objects like staples and razor blades, underscores for its pleasure principle. Carefully orchestrating the balance between these disparate forms, Agustin's works avoid extended reminiscence on pure pain. Instead, he presents us with a variety of forms designed to heighten sexual arousal or maybe evoke a vague fear. Like the often contradictory or highly sexualized imagery of the punk movement, each kind of object serves a symbolic purpose designed to reconfigure meaning. Discussing his own interest in the fine line between pleasure and pain, between sex and violence, Agustin said, "I am not exclusively an erotic painter. I tread that thin line between realism and abstract painting. My work has nothing to do with the pornographic, even though it deals with the erotic. For me, the erotic is not a fad. It has been with me since the 60s. Yes, in my work one finds sex and punishment, but I represent sex so that it is devoid of its physical or animal nature, so that it becomes its own essence. Caliban looking at himself in the mirror. Sexuality is just one of my themes." The artist's reference to Caliban brings to mind images of the subjugated body, the colonized being. For Agustin, Caliban can be interpreted as the Caribbean body, displaced, vanquished, post-colonial. In contemporary discussions of the role of Caliban in language, scholars have noted that the language that Caliban learned from his colonizer could be interpreted as a tool to respond, to change, to subvert the power relationships between the colonizer and the colonized, between the center and the periphery, between the mainstream and the margins. As other, Caliban represents the outsider who approaches his reality like a trickster figure, adapting and disrupting the codes of power for his purposes. Similarly, Fernandez and Mapplethorpe adapt the codes of the street and of desire in order to project an image that counters the square, straight, conservative hegemony of American culture. Ultimately, Agustin's works reinforce the idea that culture is the result of a number of sources, including the artist's own inventory of ideas and images, the aesthetics of the street, and the subcultures in which art thrives. Thank you.
A few questions, because you are the author of that wonderful text, Only in New York, Agustin Fernandez and the Aesthetic of Subculture. And this is in the monography of Agustin Fernandez. Then I wanted to ask you one question about, you said that, you asked a question, how does an artist absorb a new environment? And this is really interesting, because this is about every artist in that case. Then do you think when there is a meeting between two artists, as Mapplethorpe and Agustin Fernandez, there is a new environment which is created? What do you think about that idea?
I think so. I know that they visited one another's studios frequently. And so there's a new dialogue, really, that is created when two artists meet and they share a lot of ideas. And I think that dialogue is important because in the end it influences the work of both artists. So it's almost like a new moment, a new mini bubble of culture is being created there between the two of them. And they're both being influenced by the same kind of environment and using it in very different ways, but I think related.